William K. Stewart, F.E. Patzak, based on characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes and the Curse of the Vampire. The New Adventures, Episode 4, spoken by Sam Kusi. In the fall of 1883, Holmes and I travelled to Hertfordshire, a few miles to the north of London. The Very Honourable Lord Lawrence Collingwood, the 3rd Baron Collingwood, had sent a less than luxurious coach to collect us from Baker Street, along with a most urgent request for our immediate presence. The financial offer was too good to decline. Holmes, though, harboured fears of only being hired as wandering fairground attractions for the weary English peerage, which was well on its way towards social insignificance. He would turn out to be wrong. The Baron himself, already 60 years old, was the only grandson of legendary Cuthbert Collingwood, a highly decorated and esteemed companion of Admiral Horatio Nelson in the British Navy. Collingwood was raised to the peerage by King George III, the grandfather of our Queen Victoria. Since the hereditary title designated to Northumberland did not include any holdings, the family found its current rather comfortable livelihood within their private estate and land holdings outside of London. As we would learn, Collingwood's eldest of 4 sons and heir to the title, Paul, had recently died under quite mysterious circumstances. Within 2 days, he had succumbed to a severe illness that the summoned doctors could neither identify nor properly treat. After unsuccessful attempts at suppressing the symptoms, Paul perished from the unknown cause and was put to rest in the family crypt beneath the estate. Now, however, and this was the reason for Holmes's and my visit, the second eldest son, John, was seemingly stricken by the very same illness. Again, the doctors were stumped, and the Baron no longer believed in coincidences and natural causes. He suspected foul play. The police, however, were unable to draw any conclusions, and so it was up to us to get to the bottom of it. Collingwood's butler, Stephen, a white-haired man with a faint Eastern European accent, met us at the main entrance before quickly sending off the coach. "The Baron is waiting for you," he said, and took our luggage, leading the way. "Please, follow me." We entered a truly impressive entrance hall that dwarfed us by its size and height. It had an air of grandeur and a certain extravagance. A marble staircase with gold, or at least gold-coloured railings, ascended from the centre of the hall. We noticed a bust of the Admiral, portraits of the 2 first Barons and their wives, as well as Chinese vases that did not match the rest of the interior in any way. The whole interior design screamed of aristocracy. Stephen led us up the stairs to the first floor and down a long hallway where he stopped in front of a tall door. "The Baron will see you in the library," he said as he opened the door for us. "My lord, the detectives from London have arrived." "Please come in," answered a deep voice. The butler bid us to enter with his right hand and a nod. We obeyed and took 2 or 3 steps into the room as the door clicked shut behind us. The library was a large and tall room with shelves from floor to ceiling filled with books accessible by sliding ladders. Yet it was oddly dark, and therefore hard to imagine anyone doing any reading here. The Baron, a stately gentleman with a receding hairline, got up from a large wing chair, a glass of red wine in his hand. "Welcome to my humble abode," he said, displaying modesty. "Thank you," Holmes replied. "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague Dr. Watson." I bowed my head at the Baron and addressed him with a tense, "My lord." Holmes had little patience for aristocratic rituals and waited impatiently until the Baron offered us 2 seats on a long sofa. We sat down and Holmes immediately declined the drinks offered to us. "That is most kind," he said, "but we would like to get straight to the point. We are, after all, in somewhat of a rush." "I'm afraid that is correct," answered Collingwood with a sigh. Now, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, as you well know, Paul, my eldest son, died suddenly 2 weeks ago from a mysterious, rapidly progressing illness, unknown to the doctors. It was very difficult for Lady Collingwood and me to have had to lay him to rest in our family crypt. I asked the Baron to accept our condolences, but Holmes's interest had already been piqued. In the family crypt, he repeated. Quite right, Collingwood confirmed. We lay our family members to rest in a crypt beneath the estate. One of the marble sarcophagi, however, is unoccupied and only has symbolic meaning. How so? Holmes asked. You must know, the Baron explained. Paul's surprising death was not the first stroke of fate we have suffered. 2 years ago we sadly lost our youngest son, Richard. He served Her Majesty as an officer in a regiment near Calcutta, India, where he fell in a battle against locals. His body, however, could not be recovered. Richard was deemed missing for 1 year and then declared dead. Lady Collingwood was devastated throughout the ceremonial service at the empty sarcophagus. I once again extended our condolences to Collingwood, which he acknowledged with a nod. And now, the Baron continued, our second eldest son, John, also appears destined to die. I cannot accept that. And I do not believe it to be a coincidence. Our servants are already under the impression that the family is cursed. Holmes raised his eyebrows. How come your servants are susceptible to this sort of superstition? It could be their heritage, Collingwood answered. Our butler, Stephen, and maid, Mary, siblings, by the way, are from Hungary. They came to England as refugees when the Russian Soldateska stamped out the Hungarian Revolution in 1849 on behalf of the Austrian Emperor. We took them in and provided employment. Then Stephen and Mary, I interjected, and in that moment believed to make an especially astute comment, are really called Istvan and Maria, aren't they? Holmes was unwilling to engage with my comment on comparative, ethnological onomastics and just shook his head before turning back to Collingwood. Please excuse the question, but had your family been involved in anything worthy of a curse? The Baron made a conciliatory hand gesture. That's a fair question, he said firmly. Civility and morality are the cornerstones of the Collingwood household. Naturally, large property owners like us are not always popular among everyone. The bourgeoisie and peasantry are demanding social and political rights, a conflict of interest that will need to be resolved. Again, I could not control myself and mumbled, perhaps by deploying a Russian Cossack army here in England? Collingwood was so gracious as to ignore my clumsy remark, and continued, Gentlemen, this is serious. 2 of my sons are dead. My third is deathly ill, and my fourth is a dreamer pursuing a career in zoology. The Collingwood house, with its title and estates, is at the precipice of ruin. I would at least like to know who or what is responsible for this. We shall certainly get to the bottom of it, Holmes promised with his own brand of composure. We hope so, replied the Baron. I will now ask Mary to accompany you to John's room. John's room? Holmes asked. Why, yes, said Collingwood. I'm sure you'd like to examine the patient with your very own eyes. I'm a consulting detective, not a physician, Holmes said with a suddenly grave look. I cleared my throat, which only momentarily distracted Holmes before he continued. A physician would be better suited at examining. I cleared my throat again. Holmes swung towards me. For goodness sake, Watson, he said indignantly. Don't you find it a trifle impolite to keep interrupting me? Tell me, what do you have that is so terribly urgent? A medical degree, I answered dryly. A short while later, Mary, the petite middle-aged maid, showed us to John Collingwood's sickbed. Mary crossed herself in the Catholic tradition as we entered the bedroom. I walked straight to the bed to examine the patient. The poor young man was clearly delirious. He was staring off into the distance with strangely bulging eyes, hardly able to perceive what was transpiring around him. He had lost the ability to speak some time earlier, and a high fever strained his heart and circulation. I pressed my index and middle fingers against John's carotid artery to measure his pulse. But before I even flipped open my pocket watch, I could feel two peculiar wounds on the patient's neck. They were less than 1 inch apart from each other and of equal size, like 2 puncture wounds from a rather thick needle. I tilted John's head back to show Holmes the wounds. "Holmes," I called, "look at this. What do you make of it?" Mary caught a glance of John's neck before Holmes arrived at my side. She instantly froze in fright, then crossed herself again, turned round and ran out of the room, crying, "Vukodolak, Vukodolak." Holmes glared at me punishingly. "Watson, you scared the poor woman half to death." "I can't take the credit," I countered. "Her fright has more to do with Vukodolak, a blood-sucking vampire, according to Eastern European folklore." Holmes approached the bed and inspected the 2 puncture wounds on John's neck. "And these here," he asked, "are they the work of a vampire?" I took a deep breath. "Holmes, if you want to know whether these could be the impressions of fangs, the answer is yes. If you, however, want me to confirm that they were inflicted by an undead creature from the darkest depths of Pannonia, then—" "By no means," Holmes interrupted. "We could, of course, consult your esteemed, albeit eccentric, colleague from Amsterdam, Dr. Van Helsing. But I would prefer an approach based in the natural sciences." "I am delighted that we agree in this regard," I answered. "Nevertheless, we shall have to inspect the body of Collingwood's firstborn for similar wound marks." Holmes nodded in agreement. The Baron will not be very happy about disturbing his son's eternal rest. At that very moment, Stephen appeared behind us in the doorway. "Gentlemen," he announced, "the Baron and Baroness request your presence in the dining hall. Dinner is served." After greeting Lady Collingwood, who appeared careworn, although she was a good 10 years younger than her husband, we took our seats at a large table in the estate's dining hall. Mary, who was also employed as cook, seemed to have regained her composure, yet, out of precaution, had prepared garlic soup as the first course. While Holmes and I passed each other glances and knowing smiles, the Collingwoods seemed unaware of the underlying significance of this culinary choice. "Now, Dr. Watson," the Baron began the dinner conversation, "what is your impression of our son's condition from a medical standpoint?" "Regretfully, I must agree with my colleague," I replied. "Should it be an illness, I would like to refrain from making a diagnosis for the time being, as it would require further and more specific tests. Even so, there wouldn't be any guarantees." Collingwood declined. "There's no need," he stated. "I don't believe in a natural cause, nor do I believe in a supernatural one like our staff does." "You were informed about the puncture wounds?" I asked. "In a way," the Baron confirmed. "Mary believes she saw a bite mark on our son's neck. She imagines it to be the deed of a revenant, a vampire." Holmes raised his eyebrows and chimed in. "Does your lordship believe in the existence of vampires?" "I am a God-fearing man," answered Collingwood, "and if there is a heaven, there must be a hell, which one can easily imagine is haunted by all sorts of abysmal creatures. In my experience, however, evil on earth generally exists in the form of humans." Holmes nodded. "The human abyss is the most profound, and the atrocities we are capable of know few bounds." "Quite right," answered the Baron, "and that is why I expect a human being to have committed these crimes. It is on account of your invaluable detective work that we shall uncover the motive and bring the perpetrator to justice." "We are very aware of our responsibility," I interjected. "If we presume there is a plot to eliminate your sons, then the most obvious explanation for their symptoms would be poisoning. But the doctors have ruled out most common drugs used for that purpose. Isn't that so? Collingwood confirmed my suspicion with a nod. We can also rule out fugu poisoning, Holmes added. Fugu? The Baron repeated. The Japanese blowfish, Holmes explained. A most remarkable animal that carries lethal toxins inside its organs. Fugu must be awfully rare in this country, Collingwood assumed. Holmes smiled. It's less rare than you'd think. Just recently we were called to the Japanese embassy in London. I saw myself compelled to steer the conversation in another direction and interrupt Holmes. Excuse me, but we should stay with the case at hand. Let's get back to the wounds. Even if they weren't caused by the fangs of a vampire, they could have something to do with their medical condition. If that's the case, your eldest son should also have them. I'm afraid we must therefore, for better or worse, I stopped myself out of consideration for Lady Collingwood, who sat passively at the table. The Baron had already understood what I was getting at anyhow. Do what you have to do, he said determinedly. You have my permission. I thanked him with a nod. No one spoke until Mary, who was now wearing a large cross round her neck, served the main course. The roast lamb, which would normally be paired with a fine mint sauce, was doused in garlic. The Baron, Holmes, and I took it with humour. Lady Collingwood remained stoic. Holmes picked up the conversation. My lord, you had mentioned another son who was involved in zoology. What can you tell us about him? The Baron looked displeased and replied, There's not much to tell. George is a sort of animal caretaker. He works at the London Zoo, in the reptile house. A most unbecoming and unworthy occupation. Doesn't he have an academic degree in biology and zoology? I countered. That would make him more than just a zookeeper. He's a scientist. Collingwood made a dismissive hand gesture. Nonsense, he cried. He babysits that absurdly large tortoise, that blasphemous charlatan Charles Darwin, may he rot in hell, brought back from the Galapagos Islands. They even share a name, George. But seriously, tortoises, snakes, iguanas, these sorts of things aren't for us Collingwoods. Just then, Lady Collingwood rose to speak for the first time. My dear Lawrence, you mustn't forget that, as the third-born, George has no prospects to an inheritance, the title, nor the estate. It is only for that reason that he chose a different path. Holmes nodded. Yes, but that is changing. Paul is dead, and John is very ill, with uncertain prospects of recovering. Were he to die, George would move up in the line of succession. Lady Collingwood looked at Holmes sternly. Mr. Holmes, I hope you're not construing a motive. In no way was that his intention, I interjected before Holmes could answer. Please pardon us if we gave you that impression. Lady Collingwood accepted my apology with a nod. Imagine the situation we find ourselves in. George may be our last remaining son if... She stopped mid-sentence and turned her face away, fixing her eyes on the portraits of her 4 sons hanging on the wall. Lady Collingwood is hoping for a miracle, the Baron explained. She dreams of Richard's safe return. He is our youngest and her favourite. He was convinced that he needed to wage jungle warfare with the common infantry. Not much more promising an endeavour than the study of reptiles. He turned to his wife. I'm sorry, darling. Richard is dead. He won't return. At least not in one piece. Lady Collingwood did not respond. She stood up and turned to Holmes and me. Gentlemen, please excuse my retiring early. I've lost my appetite. She left the room while we were still bowing contritely. You must forgive my wife, said the Baron, unstirred. She's a trifle sensitive concerning Richard's unfortunate fate. And you? I asked. I'm not without feelings, Collingwood replied, but I face the facts. Richard was a sickly and fretful child. It's a miracle that he got into the army. As a foot soldier, anyhow, classic cannon fodder. A true Collingwood would serve his military services in the Navy like Paul and John. Holmes felt provoked by the hubris of this sentiment. Do you mean to say, he wanted to know, that Richard and George are not true Collingwoods? The Baron took a quick glance at the large chandelier hanging above the table. The Lord, he said, distributes the blood of parents to their children in unequal measure. Richard and George undoubtedly take more after their mother. I see, Holmes replied, whereas Paul and George eagerly followed in your footsteps. Collingwood nodded. At least they understood it necessary to uphold the Collingwood legacy. What will become of our family if I lose Paul and John is uncertain. He clearly had trouble putting into words this uncomfortable truth, which is why I did it for him. In that case, George would have to take your place in the line of succession. Isn't that so? The Baron answered with a resigned voice, God forbid. George is a supporter of the blasphemous evolution lie. He is an agnostic and a radical liberal Democrat. If I understand correctly, he's even in favour of women's suffrage. The Collingwoods would become the laughingstock of all England. Even Holmes, who is generally apolitical, was aware of the absurdity of these views, but we did not show it on our faces. Well then, Holmes said, let's try to contain the damage already done and prevent more from occurring. Dr. Watson and I are now ready to view the crypt. Collingwood's face again showed signs of optimism. Very well, he said. I'll show you to the basement door, but I hope you will understand that I'll refrain from accompanying you down to the crypt. A few minutes later, Holmes and I were walking down the stone spiral staircase to the family crypt, outfitted with a torch and my doctor's bag. We arrived at a vaulted cellar, dimly lit by another torch, and was attached to a wall bracket. Surrounding us were numerous sarcophagi, with the mortal remains of the Collingwood family. Holmes quickly spotted the sarcophagus we were looking for. Here it is, Watson. Here lies Paul Collingwood. He slid our torch into a wall mount and tried to move the lid, to no avail. Come on, Watson, I need help. I hesitated. Holmes grew impatient. What is it now? He asked. I stayed put. Holmes, can we be absolutely certain that there's no bloodthirsty vampire lurking beneath the lid? Holmes finished my sentence. Yes, we can. And what if there is? I stammered, feeling somewhat unsettled by the surroundings. Don't worry, Holmes reassured. At least you'll become famous. I looked at Holmes, puzzled. Why? My question provoked a bleak smile from Holmes. Well then, my good Watson, the world will know you as a man who, with courage and dedication, fought back a vampire, voluntarily sacrificing his life for the great detective Sherlock Holmes to escape in time. Thank you, I answered, resigned to my fate, as I approached the head of the coffin. You're welcome, said Holmes, who gripped the stone lid at the foot end. May I kindly ask for your assistance in lifting the lid? On 3. Holmes counted, and together we slid the lid off the sarcophagus. It was less difficult to move than we had anticipated. The relief we felt when we saw that the coffin was not empty faded quickly. Holmes immediately noted, remarkable, the body is nearly unscathed. It's as if Paul had died only yesterday. Am I correct to gather, Watson, that this is a common phenomenon among vampires? I looked at him earnestly. I am a physician, Holmes, not a demon chaser. But yes, I also presume that if the undead regularly wishes to rise and wander about, then an arrested or at least delayed decay process could be useful. In this case, however, it is much more likely that the cold temperatures here have conserved the body, like an icebox. "What about his neck?" Holmes asked. I hesitated again, then, with a burst of determination, I wrapped my fingers around Paul's head and lifted it, revealing a spot of neck covered by his chin. We immediately noticed wound marks identical to the ones we discovered on John's carotid. Whether bite marks or not, I determined they are certainly identical on both necks. Holmes turned and walked around the sarcophagus. "That's interesting," he muttered. "Who does such a thing, and why?" We suddenly heard footsteps and voices coming down the stairs. Holmes assessed the situation quickly and whispered to me, "Hide. In the back of the crypt. Hurry!" I let go of the head still in my hands and jumped for cover behind the sarcophagus towards the back. Holmes followed closely behind. We waited in a cowering position as the voices slowly approached. They were the voices of Stephen and Mary, and their silhouettes quickly became visible by the flickering torchlight. "Stay close behind me, Maria," Stephen ordered. "We don't know whether the Vokodolak has awoken." The siblings approached Paul's coffin and stepped into the light. Both were wearing garlic wreaths round their necks. Mary grasped a large crucifix with the Messiah's tortured body in front of her, and Stephen held a sharp wooden stake in front of his chest with a tip pointing forward. "Look," Mary whispered, "the coffin is open. Be careful." The butler inched towards the sarcophagus until he could catch a glimpse of Paul. He sighed with relief. "Don't worry. He's still inside." "But the lid is open," remarked Mary. "The Vokodolak could jump out at any moment and attack us." Stephen considered it briefly, then instructed, "We must be quick. Here, take the stick. Position it directly above the heart, and I'll pound on it with the hammer." In our hiding place, I poked Holmes lightly in the ribs to signal that we must put an immediate end to this unnecessary desecration, but he waved me off. Apparently he wished to wait and see a trifle longer. Mary hesitated, her trembling hands clutching the crucifix. "Must I really?" she asked, frightened. Stephen grew impatient. "Would you rather wait for the Vokodolak to awaken?" Mary shook her head decidedly. She took the stake from her brother with one hand while tightly curling her fingers around Christ's body with the other. She gathered her courage and stood over the open coffin. She then stretched out her hand holding the stake. "Is this good?" she asked, her head turned away and eyes closed. Stephen shook his head. "You need to look. We want to puncture his heart, not his stomach." Mary turned her head back towards the coffin, her eyes still shut tightly. She blinked for a fraction of a second and navigated the stake, as far as I could tell, directly above the heart. "Now you," she said resolutely. The butler stood next to his sister. We saw the rustic wooden hammer in his right hand. "Strike it," Mary demanded, but now Stephen hesitated. Then he swung the hammer, and the time was ripe for us to put an end to this spectacle. I jumped out from behind our hideout and shouted, "Stop!" Naturally, I had not considered that the servants may not recognize us in the dark. "There, another Vokodolak," cried Mary, full of horror. To my surprise, she pointed at me and hid behind her brother, who did not hesitate before hurling the hammer in my direction, hitting me squarely on the forehead. I fell to the floor with a cry of pain while Holmes popped up next to me. "Settle down, we don't want to wake any of the dead," he said as he took 2 steps towards the siblings. "It's us, Holmes and Watson. Don't you recognize us?" Mary daringly pointed the sharp wooden stake at Holmes. "Don't take another step," she commanded, and turned to her brother. "He may look like Mr. Holmes, but perhaps he has already been bitten." Stephen nodded. "Were you bitten, Mr. Holmes?" he asked. "Certainly not, I'm fine," Holmes explained and stepped into the light. He showed his not exactly pristine teeth and remarked, "You see, no fangs." Mary lowered the wooden stake. "Very well," she said, "but what about Dr. Watson?" A highly relevant and long overdue question, in my opinion. "He's fine too," Holmes claimed without even so much as glancing at me. "He'll survive the bump on his head." "And what shall we do with Sir Paul?" cried Stephen, "now that he's a Vukudulak?" Holmes took the stake out of Mary's hand while I stood up with a shocking headache, and reappeared from behind the tomb, holding the hammer. "Paul is not a Vukudulak. He is a regular human being, just like you and me. There are no vampires here," Holmes reassured in a calm voice. "Not here, not in Budapest, not in Transylvania, not in Styria. If poor Paul Collingwood were a devilish bloodsucker, then he'd already have attacked and killed all four of us. And if you, Stephen and Mary, would from now on please resist the urge to perform your superstitious rituals, then we will make sure that Lord Collingwood hears nothing about this incident. Do we have an understanding?" Stephen and Mary consulted each other briefly in Hungarian before the brother replied, "All right, but we are not taking any chances. If you would please allow—" He took the crucifix from his sister, walked up to Paul's coffin, and laid it over the body's torso. "Now we are ready to close the sarcophagus," Stephen declared, and gripped the top end of the lid. Holmes walked to the opposite side, and together they closed Paul Collingwood's sarcophagus once again, granting him this time-lasting, eternal peace. Thereupon we climbed back up the spiral staircase out of the crypt. We returned to our room once Mary was through inexpertly treating my wounded head in the kitchen, while Stephen apologized to me repeatedly for his accurate aim. Lord Collingwood and his wife had already gone to bed, and the two servants saw after John one more time. Holmes and I were given a shared room with 2 beds at the end of a long hallway on the first floor of the west wing. The antique oil lamp that Stephen had provided us only gave off a dim light, which nevertheless helped guide us to our destination. Before Holmes even opened the door, I brought up the disturbing and unsatisfying events of the day. "We have a problem," I stated matter-of-factly. Holmes looked at me, amused. "Only one?" he asked. In fact, a whole range of unresolved tasks and questions lay before us. From my perspective, there was little reason to hope for a quick resolution. As bitter as it was, we would have to consider failing at our assignment. "We have seldomly gathered so many interesting facts in such a short time," I continued, "but we haven't come any closer to solving the case. We know nothing about the cause of John's illness, and therefore can't do anything to help him. We don't know what caused these alleged bite marks on the necks of Paul and John. I wish it were a vampire. At least then we would know what we are dealing with and what needs to be done." Holmes looked at the hammer and the wooden stake in his hand, which, as a precaution, we had not returned to the Hungarian servants. He raised them with a youthful grin. "Whatever happens," he said with a serious voice, "we are prepared." I sighed audibly and opened the door. The room was dark. The light from my oil lamp and a few reflections illuminated only certain corners of the room. As we were entering, Holmes suddenly held me back. "Wait," he ordered. "We are not alone here." Indeed, we could hear noises coming from Holmes's bed in the right-hand corner of the room. First, a rustling noise as if someone were moving underneath the sheets. Then, a curious hissing sound that became increasingly louder and sounded quite threatening. I held up the lamp. We saw the reflection of 2 glowing green eyes with narrow, vertical slit pupils. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" I shouted and took a step towards the bed. I then saw the teeth of a carnivore with 2 sharp fangs flash before my eyes. "The vampire!" I stuttered and retreated, tipping on the edge of the rug and falling on my back. The lamp dropped out of my hand and immediately set part of the rug ablaze. Meanwhile, the screeching assailant was coming after me with quick motions. It towered over me with glowing eyes and bare fangs, ready to bite into my neck. But it certainly was no vampire, nor was it human, which now became apparent, but a giant snake, whose upper body and white head swayed back and forth in front of my face. "Don't move," Holmes said calmly. He slowly approached the snake from behind and swung the hammer as if it were a cricket bat. "Quick, Holmes," I whispered. "It's going to bite me any moment now." Holmes managed to strike the snake the very moment it leapt forward to bite. He hit it on the back of his head, and it sank to the floor between my legs, where it remained motionless. I jumped up immediately and dashed towards the door. "Keep calm," said Holmes. "It's dead." He went to the bed and picked up a blanket, which he used to snuff out the small carpet fire. Still in shock, I stammered, "What kind of beast is this?" Naja, Holmes said casually, as he was defeating the flames. "Excuse me?" I asked. Naja, Holmes repeated. He stood up, picked up the old lamp and used it to light the candles in the room. Within seconds, the room was bright. I breathed a deep sigh of relief. "Listen, Holmes," I explained slowly, "since I just barely escaped death. Thank you, by the way, for your brave intervention. My mood can only tolerate so much of your humor. What exactly do you want to tell me?" Holmes shook his head and pointed at the snake. "I simply answered your question. The lifeless animal at your feet is an Indian cobra. Its scientific name is Naja. I regained my composure, picked the wooden stake off the floor, and used it to carefully lift the snake with its body hanging down on both sides. After examining it, specifically the characteristic pattern on the back of its hood, I was able to confirm Holmes' assessment. "Indeed," I said, "a remarkably large specimen of the Indian cobra, also known as spectacled cobra. A deadly but splendid animal. Too bad that it is." I interrupted myself when I heard the cobra hiss, ever so quietly. The supposed slain reptile had clearly regained consciousness and started slithering on the stake. "Holmes," I cried, dismayed, "the dead snake is alive! Do something!" I tried to hold the cobra as far away from my body as possible, but with a 6-foot snake on a short stake, it was going to be a foreseeably futile endeavor. "Holmes," I insisted, "there's no time like the present." Holmes scanned the room and discovered a Chinese vase atop the washstand. He rushed to it, picked it up, and brought it over to me. "I'm here," he ordered, as he opened the porcelain lid just in time. Luckily, I managed to drop the cobra, which was still a trifle dazed, into the opening of the vase. Holmes closed the lid as soon as it was in, and we both breathed sighs of relief. After some reflection, Holmes concluded, "We must consult an expert." In a feat of heroic self-control, despite of having been in mortal peril twice, I had already regained my sense of humor. "Very well," I agreed, "but where will we find an Indian snake charmer in these parts?" Holmes had apparently taken my quip more seriously than I expected. "Not a problem, Watson," he explained. These days, every oh-so-shabby fair includes a fakir as one of its attractions, but it's charlatanry. We need a herpetologist, a scholar of reptiles, and I know just the person. I was still trying to figure out what Holmes wanted from an expert in zoology when he seated himself at the desk and began writing a short letter. I decided not to interrupt him. Instead, I made sure that the lid of the vase was fastened securely as I heard another hissing sound come from inside of it. Holmes slid the finished letter into an envelope, sealed it, addressed it, and handed it to me. "Watson, would you be so good as to find the butler? Wake him if need be. He must see to it that this letter gets to London immediately. Tonight. It's a matter of life and death." I took the envelope and, before making my way to find Stephen, said, "Very well, but I would like to know what you're hatching up now." Holmes nodded. "Naturally, my dear Watson, but all in due course. What's important now is that you bring this letter to Stephen." I was holding the knob, about to open the door, when I turned to Holmes once more and said, "And what will you do in the meantime?" "Well," Holmes said, serenely as ever, "as long as there are no further venomous animals hiding under the sheets, I'm considering going to bed. I would thus be very grateful if you didn't make any noise when you return. And please don't forget to lock the door. Someone just tried to murder us after all. Good night." The next morning, we awoke at the first cockcrow. Holmes slept like a log, but I hardly managed to shut an eye. The hair-raising events of the previous evening, the cobra sounds from the vase, as well as the possibility of further attempts on our lives, did not allow me to sleep. Holmes jumped out of bed, refreshed, clapping his hands, and with a thirst for action. I, meanwhile, had to put out effort to drag myself to the table in our room. I could not hide from Holmes how shaken up I still felt. "Good heavens, Watson," he said, "you look terrible." "Thank you," I answered, and fell into a chair. Holmes paused, then glanced at the sideboard with the spirits. "You haven't been drinking, have you?" I indicated that I had not, with an annoyed, dismissive wave of the hands. "Pardon me, Holmes," I excused myself immediately thereafter, "but I'm presently lacking the composure for such debates. Death and decay, infirmity, vampires, exorcisms and curses, an underground crypt, deadly venomous snakes on an aristocratic estate. It's all a bit much. You'd think we are characters in a Gothic novella." "Do not despair," Holmes remarked cheerfully. He was apparently feeling quite optimistic. "I'm sure everything will be solved today." I shook my head slowly and looked at Holmes earnestly. "Presuming the spectacled cobra, which is not native to this country, is not the sole suspect, the challenges before us are considerable. 1.5 murders and 2 attempted murders using a cobra as an insidious weapon. How would you go about solving this? Who does such a thing?" Holmes remained unstirred and began packing his pipe. "That's precisely what we must find out," he said. "Who had the motive, means, and opportunity to perpetrate these crimes? That person will be the culprit." Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door. Holmes opened, and the butler entered the room holding a breakfast tray. "Good morning, gentlemen," Stephen said as he approached the table and set down the tray containing tea and pastries. Then he spotted the burn mark on the rug and shook his head. "That will be expensive," he muttered, more to himself than to us, before turning back to us. "Did you gentlemen have a pleasant night?" "As pleasant as can be," Holmes replied. "Is it fair to presume that our letter was sent to London yesterday?" "Certainly," Stephen confirmed. "It was sent immediately with the night courier. You can expect a reply soon." "I hope so," Holmes muttered, also more to himself than to Stephen. The butler now turned to me. Unfortunately, I must tell you of unpleasant and worrying events that took place last night. First, Sir John's condition has worsened significantly. We fear he won't survive the day. Holmes and I both acknowledged this foreseeable news by nodding our heads. And secondly, Stephen continued, my sister Maria seems to have suffered a great shock. After checking in on Sir John, she returned very upset, stuttering that she had seen a ghost. Since then, she hasn't spoken a word. A ghost? Holmes repeated and raised one eyebrow. I clapped somewhat sardonically and cried, Yes, of course, a ghost. That's what was missing from our house of horrors. Splendid. Holmes punished me with a harsh look, then turned to Stephen. What Dr. Watson, a professed doctor of medicine by trade, really wanted to say is that he will promptly check on the well-being of your sister. I cleared my throat and confirmed this with a succinct yes. The butler thanked us and left. Holmes took a seat at the table, poured himself a cup of tea, and lit his pipe. By his actions, it appeared as though we had all the time in the world. This perplexed me, so I decided to stare straight at Holmes. It took 2 long minutes before I garnered a reaction. What's the matter, Watson? He asked reproachfully. Why are you still sitting here so idly? Don't you have 2 patients to visit? Before I could protest, Holmes added, And don't forget your doctor's bag. Go see Mary first, and we'll reconvene at Sir John's bed in 30 minutes. When, a half an hour later, I entered the room of the Collingwood heir, Holmes was already there. He stood by the bed with his back turned to the door, yet he knew it was me the moment I arrived. And Watson? He asked, without turning around. How is the maid feeling? I stopped and waited for Holmes to turn to me, but he never did. For better or worse, I was forced to speak to his back. Difficult to say, I answered diligently. Mary is barely responsive, shows no reactions, but she's still conscious. She's arrested in a deep state of fear, likely caused by a traumatic event. This kind of condition cannot be cured in a matter of days. For now, she remains in her rocking chair, swaying back and forth, clasping the crucifix on her necklace, while occasionally muttering a few words in Hungarian, which even Stephen can't make much sense of. All he can make out are snippets such as ghost, dead and undead. From a purely physiological perspective, however, there is nothing wrong with her. I understand, mumbled Holmes, who seemed almost absent, and would not take his eyes off John Collingwood. Since Holmes's silence indicated that he had no further questions, I was eager to check on the other patient. I walked up to Holmes at the bed and examined John. His condition had indeed worsened significantly. He was now in a sort of comatose state, in a deep sleep, with a reduced heart rate and limited circulation, from which he would likely not awaken. Furthermore, there was a chance that he had already suffered brain damage at this point. He will die, I concluded, and looked at Holmes. Holmes instantly snapped back from his absence and said, He most certainly will, but not today. Just then, we heard the deep ringing of the doorbell from the ground floor announce the arrival of her guest. Who may this be? I asked. Did they already send for a priest? Nonsense, Watson, Holmes refuted. That is John's saviour. He walked out of the room faster than was his usual pace, Once out the door, he went down the hall to the top of the stairs, from where I heard him call out, "Stephen, send him up to John's room at once." Holmes returned with a peculiar, contented expression. "What's going on here, Holmes?" I wanted to know. "Patience," he reassured. "Soon, all will become clearer." A young man appeared at the door. He was wearing khakis, working boots, and a brown shirt. His round glasses sat on a face not entirely unfamiliar to us. "Good day," he said as he put down his small suitcase on top of the dresser. "I came as fast as I could. It's a good thing you wrote, Mr. Holmes." Holmes turned to me. I still felt rather confused about the unfolding events. "May I introduce you, Watson? This is Mr. "George Collingwood," I interrupted, remembering the portraits hanging in the estate's dining room. "Quite right," Holmes confirmed, cheated of a small surprise. He then turned to the new arrival. "Did you bring what I asked?" "Naturally," George answered. He opened his suitcase, took out a small bottle containing a clear liquid, and handed it to Holmes. Holmes thanked him. He took my doctor's bag, which I was holding, began rummaging through it, and finally found a new syringe set. He looked at me and said, "Watson, please bare John's left arm and prepare it for injection." I obeyed while Holmes filled the syringe with the liquid brought by George. He then approached the bedside, easily found the right spot on John's arm for the injection, thanks to his own cocaine infusions, and proceeded to inject the substance, still unknown to me, intravenously. "All right," said Holmes, and turned around to us. Holmes and George looked satisfied, but I still had my suspicions. "Gentlemen," I began, "to my knowledge, I am the only doctor in this room. In that sense, I would like to be enlightened as to what just occurred here." Holmes nodded. He seemed understanding for once. "Naturally, last night when it became clear that Paul's death and John's condition was caused by the bite and venom of an Indian cobra, I immediately thought of someone who has experience with reptiles." "As the perpetrator?" I interjected and glanced at George. Holmes shook his head. "Upon close reflection," he explained, "I could rule George out. He has not been seen at his family's estate for months, and any long absences would have been noticed by his employers at the London Zoo, not to mention the theft of a spectacled cobra. But something else occurred to me. The zoo staff habitually handles all kinds of venomous animals in the reptile house and the insect and spider terrariums. Not just snakes, but also scorpions, arachnids, and amphibians. As a result, accidental bites must occur every now and then." "That's right," George confirmed. "Despite all necessary precautions, employees occasionally do get bitten or stung. And that is why," Holmes continued, "the reptile house closely cooperates with the Institution for Tropical Medicine, which has a collection of antidotes for various venoms, toxins, and illnesses. I injected Sir John with an antiserum for Indian cobra venom, which will mitigate its effects, allowing the body to expel it. This will certainly take a toll on John's system, but in theory, he should be able to make a full recovery." "That's wonderful news," I cried. "We must inform Lord and Lady Collingwood at once." "Slow down, Watson," Holmes warned. "The unidentified murderer and assailant are still at large." Holmes was right, of course. The perpetrator had not yet been caught and could plan his next moves. This was something we certainly needed to anticipate. After a short pause for thought, Holmes instructed, "Watson, please be so good as to first inform the family and employees about Sir John's imminent recovery. Then please ask everyone to convene in the library in a half an hour. I will solve the case there." "Solve?" I repeated, unbelievingly. Holmes looked at me impatiently. "Yes, naturally. That's why we're here, isn't it?" 40 minutes later, we were waiting in the library for Holmes. The Baron, thrilled about the prospect of John's recovery but wary of George's presence, already had poured himself a glass of red wine, despite of the early hour. Lady Collingwood sat motionless in a chair and did not seem very interested in the others. George, displaying a rebellious familiarity with the employees, was telling Stephen about the latest labour laws. Mary was brought into the library in her rocking chair. Her mental state had not yet improved. I myself was strolling past the bookshelves, reading the spine of a book every once in a while, waiting impatiently for Holmes to arrive. "Where is our master detective?" Lord Collingwood cried as he poured himself another glass. I did not have an answer to the question, as unpunctuality never was one of Holmes's traits. I was much more nervous about the fact that he had asked me for my Webley revolver right before we separated in John's room. "Mr. Holmes will certainly arrive soon and answer all our questions," I claimed. 5 more minutes passed, and Holmes had still not arrived. He was now 15 minutes late, which was somewhat unusual. Then the door finally opened. Holmes entered holding my revolver, but he was not alone. He was followed by someone else, a ghost. Mary shrieked and crossed herself 3 times. She, like all of us, recognized Richard, the youngest Collingwood, who was believed to be dead. The Baron dropped his wine glass. George took his glasses off and squinted. Stephen stuttered. "Sir Richard, you're alive?" Only Lady Collingwood remained unmoved and expressionless. "Holmes, is everything all right?" I cried and approached him. "Quite all right," Holmes reassured. "Please excuse my tardiness, but it was part of my plan. The murderer had to believe that everyone was gathered in the library, giving him the opportunity to strike again. And indeed, the murderer sneaked into John's room and tried to suffocate him with a pillow. What he didn't know was that I was waiting for him behind the curtain, armed with a revolver." "But how is that possible?" I asked. "The following happened," Holmes began. Sir Richard, only 4th in line of succession, unloved by his father, had apparently faked his own death in India. After some time, he returned to England incognito with a large cobra in his luggage and the intent of correcting the line of succession in his favour. Paul and John needed to die. George would have renounced the position anyway, and then, just as Lady Collingwood had always hoped, her lost son would have returned after all, telling an adventurous tale of how he got lost in a Bengalese jungle or was held captive by indigenous rebels, and how, by fortunate circumstances, he had survived and found his way back. After the death of his father, which he may have also helped expedite, Richard would have become the 4th Baron Collingwood. The current 3rd Baron approached Holmes and his son. He looked at the latter in anguish. "Is it true, Richard?" he asked. "Did you murder Paul? Did you try to kill John?" Lady Collingwood suddenly jumped out of her chair. "Don't answer," she cried. "Don't say a word. They don't have any proof." The Baron's shock was written all over his face. Holmes seemed less surprised. "My lady," he said, "I'm afraid we have some strong evidence, even without your confession. Besides, I'm certain that the police will find sufficient substantiation and evidence when they search Richard's secret quarters, which I assume are located on the estate, as well as his accomplices' private chambers. I took the cue from Holmes and accepted my role as sidekick. His accomplice? Quite right, Holmes explained. Richard would have needed support to help finance his stay in India, his return trip to England, and his time in hiding. He would have needed to know about the proceedings here at the estate and have access to all rooms at the right times. All this would have been impossible without the help of an insider. The Baron looked at George first, then at Stephen with piercing eyes. The butler shook his head vehemently while George tapped his forehead twice, turning Collingwood's attention back to Holmes. Holmes picked up where he left off. Your lordship will not like to hear it, but unfortunately, the complicity lies with your wife. Lydia, cried the Baron, shocked. How could you? The Baroness realized she had been caught. Only a confession would save her from death by hanging. Ignoring her husband, she stood up and took a couple of paces toward Holmes and me. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, she said determinedly, her chin raised. Would you be so kind as to bring my son and me into the custody of the police? I can't stand one more minute surrounded by these walls and this company. Holmes nodded. Very well, my lady, he answered, and led her and Richard Collingwood outside. I followed immediately. A few days later, Holmes and I were having tea on Baker Street, studying the newspaper articles about our latest case. The Collingwood scandal caused quite a stir and filled pages upon pages of thrilling reports. The patriarch a tyrant, the Baroness a Lady Macbeth, Sir Richard an unscrupulous brother-killer. The Collingwoods had fallen from grace in society. The family has now suffered something of a curse, after all, I remarked. Holmes did not agree with my point of view. For simple minds, it may appear that way, he countered. But really, it was the thirst for power and prestige, and the greed and envy of certain individuals that led to these events, and to their collective downfall. The soulless void of their existence is the true curse of the lower nobility. Maybe, I answered unmoved, but my empathy is limited. John Collingwood is in Capri for the next 4 weeks, restoring his existence. But he will have to deal with the weight of his family history one day, remarked Holmes. Well, I determined, then only George managed to avoid the curse by deciding to renounce his family and status. How is his youngest, fosterling, by the way? Holmes asked with a sudden, serious interest. I had to laugh. Don't worry, Holmes, I answered. The cobra has recovered well from your hammer strike. It has become a veritable attraction at the London Zoo's reptile house. Not all zoos can boast a convicted murderer, after all. The end. This has been Sherlock Holmes and the Curse of the Vampire, The New Adventures, Episode 4, by William K. Stewart and F. E. Patzak, based on the characters created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Spoken by Sam Kusi.